The paper landed on the counter with a crisp slap, as though it carried the weight of a verdict. I looked up from rinsing the teacup I had just finished, startled by the way Callista's manicured fingers lingered on the folded sheet. She stood tall in her emerald dress, the kind of thing that looked more suited for a cocktail lounge than my kitchen, and smiled at me with a brightness that always felt one shade away from cruelty. "Here it is," she said. Voice sweet, but pitched to carry. 32 confirmed guests for Christmas dinner. 32. My stomach tightened before I even touched the paper. I wiped my hands on the dish towel and unfolded the list. Names scrolled down the page in Callista's neat handwriting. Family neighbors, colleagues of Damien's people I barely knew. Each line seemed to stretch into another demand. I lifted my eyes to her. 32. That's more than double last year. She shrugged, glancing at the kitchen clock as if she had an appointment waiting. "Well, we had catering reserved, but it seemed wasteful. You always do it better. Why pay thousands when you can give everyone that home-cooked touch?" The words lodged in my throat. Catering. She had booked it, she knew the work involved, and then canceled. Just like that. Across the table, Damien sat with his phone glowing inches from his nose. He grunted something that might have been agreement or simply acknowledgement that he'd heard a human voice. I steadied myself against the counter. "Callista, I don't." The doorbell cut me off. She swept across the floor in swift, confident strides, heels clicking like punctuation marks. When she opened the door, 2 early guests stepped in coats dusted with snow. I recognized them only vaguely, one of Damien's co-workers and his wife. Callista greeted them warmly, pulling them into the kitchen before I could slip away. "And here's our secret weapon," she announced, laying a hand on my shoulder, as though she were presenting me like a prize dish. "Marjorie insists on cooking the entire feast herself this year." 32 mouths, and she wouldn't hear of caterers. "Isn't she marvelous?" The wife beamed politely, murmuring something about real holiday spirit. The husband chuckled and said, "That's dedication." My tongue turned heavy. I wanted to speak to correct the lie, but Callista's grip pressed against my shoulder, gentle but firm, like she was pinning me in place. Damien finally lifted his eyes from the phone long enough to nod in vague confirmation. I swallowed the words that burned to escape. "Oh, it's nothing," I heard myself say, the smile on my lips brittle. Just what families do. The couple laughed lightly and moved toward the living room, following Callista's sweeping gesture. She lingered, her lips curving in satisfaction. "You see," she whispered. Just for me, her tone a velvet blade. "Everyone admires you. Don't ruin it." When she turned away, I exhaled slowly, the air trembling in my chest. I looked down at the guest list again. Names blurred together, but the number at the bottom stayed sharp, 32. I pressed my hand flat against the counter, grounding myself against the cold granite. Jonas used to stand beside me at times like this, steady and kind, telling me we could handle anything together. But Jonas was gone, and now it was just me, with a list that felt less like celebration and more like a sentence. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it under the corner of the fruit bowl. Callista's laughter drifted from the living room, mingling with the hum of early conversation. Damien's voice rose once low and indistinct, then faded back into silence. I poured myself another cup of tea, though the water had cooled, and let the bitterness coat my tongue. My protest had been swallowed, buried under Callista's performance. Around me, the house buzzed with other people's anticipation. Inside me, something sharp and restless began to stir. The list was still there, waiting on the counter, when I turned toward the window and saw the December snow falling steady and silent across the yard. That night, after the last of the early arrivals had drifted upstairs to guest rooms, and Callista had retired with Damien, in her usual flurry of instructions, I sat alone in the kitchen. The list still rested beneath the fruit bowl, its corner jutting out like a reminder I couldn't ignore. The house hummed with silence, and in that quiet memory, crept in uninvited. I saw Jonas at the stove, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, stirring cranberry sauce with the same concentration he once gave to balancing the family checkbook. His laugh would bounce against the walls when I pretended to taste test too often, and he'd swat at my hand with the wooden spoon. "Patience, Marjorie," he'd say. "It needs time, like everything good." I remembered the way we used to rise early on Christmas morning, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. I'd put on the old plaid apron my mother gave me, and Jonas would hum along to carols while kneading dough for rolls. Our kitchen would fill with warmth and cinnamon, the windows fogging against the cold outside. Those dinners never felt like burdens. They felt like love made visible golden turkey, resting on the platter we saved for special occasions, mashed potatoes smooth as silk pies, cooling on the counter, while grandchildren tore through wrapping paper in the next room. Jonas would carve, I would serve, and at the end of the evening, we would collapse on the couch together. Full and happy, our hands intertwined under the old quilt. The memory made the kitchen around me now feel even colder. The counters gleamed, but they were sterile. The list of names was long, but my own wasn't among them. The smell of bleach lingered faintly, not cinnamon or nutmeg. Jonas had always been the balance to my labor. He saw me, truly saw me not as the invisible pair of hands that made holidays happen, but as a partner. When relatives praised the spread, he redirected the compliments. "You should see the work Marjorie does." None of this would happen without her. And when I brushed it off, embarrassed, he'd whisper later, "Don't you dare make yourself small. You're the heart of this family." I pressed the heel of my palm to my chest, as though I could summon back the solidity of his voice. Without him, every task felt heavier. What once had been joy now sat on me like a weight. Callista's announcement earlier had shown just how easily my willingness had been twisted into obligation. She hadn't even given me the chance to say no. I rose from the table and opened the drawer, where we still kept the apron faded, now the fabric soft from years of washing. I slipped it over my head. It no longer fit the same. The strings barely reached to tie at my waist. I stood there, staring at my reflection in the microwave door apron hanging awkwardly, and felt the ache of absence. I tried to imagine Christmas morning as it used to be, laughter, partnership, small chaos, contained by shared affection. Instead, I saw myself alone at 4 a.m, shoving pans into the oven while Callista slept upstairs. 32 plates, 32 mouths, and not one person thinking to offer me a chair at the table. The contrast stung so sharply, I tugged the apron off and stuffed it back into the drawer. My hands shook as I closed it. I told myself to breathe. I told myself I still had strength, that somewhere in me the woman Jonas had loved was waiting, not just the one who let herself be used. I leaned against the counter, steadying myself, and the echo of his words came again. "Don't you dare make yourself small." The list was still on the counter, glaring at me, daring me to believe I had no choice at all. The next morning, Callista swept into the kitchen with a clipboard in hand, the kind of efficiency you'd expect from a hotel manager rather than a daughter-in-law. She pinned a laminated board to the refrigerator, a menu written in bold black ink with gold flourishes around the edges. Presentation matters, she said, stepping back to admire her work. Guests like to know what they're being served. I moved closer, adjusting my glasses. Turkey with sage stuffing, honey-glazed ham, whipped sweet potatoes with marshmallows, 7 sides, 4 desserts, homemade bread, all written like a promise to strangers. My eyes traced the elegant script until I reached the bottom. Christmas Dinner by Callista and Damien. The words gleamed under the kitchen lights. My name was not there. I let my hand fall to my side, steadying myself. That's a lot of dishes, I said quietly. 32 portions for everything. It's more than one person can handle. Callista turned her smile fixed and radiant, the kind people mistake for kindness until they notice the sharpness in her eyes. You always manage, Marjorie. You've got a system. Remember last year everyone was raving about your roles. Damien looked up from his phone long enough to add, "Yeah, Mom. You've got this. Don't stress." Then he slipped his earbuds in, dismissing me as efficiently as flicking off a light. I tried again. It's not just the rolls. It's the roasts, the pies, the shopping. Even with catering, this would have been. Callista cut me off with a little laugh, the kind that said my protest amused her more than it worried her. That's the beauty of it, really. You make it look so effortless. People would rather taste something real, not catered. We're all lucky you're willing. Willing? The word snagged in my chest. I hadn't been asked. She turned back to her clipboard, jotting down times for each dish, as though I were an assistant in her kitchen. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The words pressed against my throat, but refused to come out. It was easier, after all these years, to stay quiet. Instead, I busied myself wiping a counter that was already clean. My reflection blurred against the polished granite, a woman moving soundlessly in the background. I thought of Jonas again. He would have noticed the omission on the menu. He would have said, "That's your meal. Your name should be there." But Jonas wasn't here, and Damien only saw his phone screen. Callista saw an opportunity to shine at a party she didn't intend to lift a finger for. Later, when I carried groceries in from the car, I found Damien in the living room with his feet up, scrolling without a care. "Can you give me a hand?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He glanced at the bags, then back to his screen. "I'll help later, Mom. Just put the cold stuff away first." I stood there a moment, watching my own son dismiss me with the ease of habit. A pang shot through me, sharper than I expected. Somewhere along the way, he had grown comfortable, letting me shoulder the weight of every holiday. I took the bags back to the kitchen, setting them down one by one. The laminated menu caught my eye again. My name missing, my work invisible. Callista walked past just then, humming a carol under her breath. "Don't forget the nut-free option for the Sanders boy," she tossed over her shoulder. "It's life-threatening, so no mistakes." No mistakes. 32 plates. No credit. And a smile that never softened, only sliced. I placed the milk into the refrigerator and closed the door slowly, my hand still resting on the handle. The kitchen lights gleamed off the menu board, and in the reflection, I saw myself standing alone. By Saturday morning, the shopping list had grown into a booklet. Callista had left it on the counter beside the menu board, a neat grid of ingredients with measurements so precise it looked like something out of a culinary textbook. I folded it into my purse, knowing the weight of paper was nothing compared to the weight of the cart, it promised. The grocery store parking lot was crowded, everyone scrambling for last-minute supplies, and I wedged myself between carts with the patience of someone too tired to rush. Inside, I began filling the cart with the first round of essentials: 20 pounds of potatoes, bags of carrots, sacks of flour and sugar. By the third aisle, the cart already groaned under the load. I reached for a frozen turkey, wrestling with the cold bulk, when the thought struck me I would need 3 of them. 3 birds each, heavier than a small child. I heaved the first into the cart, my back straining. The second followed with less grace, nearly tipping the cart forward. By the time I secured the third, my hands shook from the effort. A familiar voice rose behind me. "Marjorie, is that you under there?" I turned, brushing hair from my forehead, and found Vivienne standing with her own modest basket coffee, a loaf of bread, a box of tea. She was bundled in her red scarf, eyes sharp as ever. "You planning to feed the whole county?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I tried to smile, though it felt weak. "Just 32. Give or take." Vivienne let out a low whistle. "Lord have mercy. And you're doing that by yourself?" I adjusted the strap of my purse, trying to sound casual. "Callista canceled catering, said it was too expensive. Apparently, I always manage." Her eyes narrowed, not at me, but at the explanation itself. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Careful, honey. Watching someone drown while standing on the dock isn't help. It's cruelty," with a polite face. The words struck me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to argue, to insist it wasn't that bad, but the denial caught in my throat. I thought of the list, the menu board, the missing name. I thought of my hands raw from washing dishes before the cooking had even begun. Vivienne reached out, steadying the cart as it wobbled under the weight. "Don't let them turn you into invisible hands doing everything while they brag about the feast. You deserve better." Her voice softened, but her eyes never left mine. For a moment, I felt seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't in years. I thanked her, fumbling, and pushed on, but her words followed me down every aisle. They echoed as I piled bags of cranberries, cartons of cream, tins of cocoa into the cart. They pressed against me when I loaded 3 hams, their glaze packets rattling like accusations. By the time I reached the checkout, the cart looked less like abundance and more like burden. The cashier scanned item after item, the total climbing higher than I cared to admit. I swiped Damien's card with trembling hands, knowing he would see the charge and perhaps make a comment later about extravagance. The receipt stretched like a ribbon, proof of labor not yet done. Back home, I unloaded the car in trips, each bag heavier than the last. The refrigerator filled to bursting. Counters disappeared beneath towers of ingredients. I stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by abundance that felt more like chains. I thought of Vivienne's words, the dock, the drowning. My fingers traced the edge of the receipt still curled in my pocket. For years I had told myself that being needed was the same as being loved. But now, with the kitchen crowded and my name missing from the menu board, I wasn't so sure. The paper crinkled in my hand as I tucked it away, and the echo of her warning refused to fade. By Sunday afternoon, the house smelled faintly of pine from the tree Callista had insisted on decorating herself, or rather directing others to decorate. She perched on the arm of a chair in the living room clipboard, balanced on her knee, calling out instructions, as Damien and a few visiting cousins hung ornaments. I stayed in the kitchen, sorting through the mountain of groceries, grateful for the excuse of distance. When I carried a tray of mugs into the living room, hot chocolate for the children, coffee for the adults, I noticed a large poster board spread across the dining table. A chart ruled into neat squares, each one filled with names written in Callista's rounded script. The seating arrangement. I set the tray down carefully and drifted closer. Names leapt out at me: the Sanders family, the Foster's cousins I hadn't seen in years, even a pair of Damien's colleagues. Each seat labeled with precision forks and knives sketched lightly in pencil beside them. At the head of the table, Damien and Callista. I scanned the rows once, twice. My name wasn't there. For a moment I thought I must have overlooked it. I bent closer, tracing each row with my finger. 32 names lined up like guests in a courtroom. But not mine. Not anywhere. A strange heat rose in my chest, not quite anger, not quite grief, but something tangled between. I was preparing this dinner, stretching myself across every detail, and I wasn't even considered a participant. "Isn't it perfect?" Callista's voice rang out, breaking my trance. She was suddenly at my shoulder, the scent of her perfume sharp and sweet. "Everyone has a place. Order is so important at gatherings like this." I forced my lips into a smile. "Yes, order." She reached over, adjusting one of the name cards already laid on the table. "Damien's boss prefers an aisle seat. Easier to get up for drinks." I nodded, though I wasn't listening. My eyes still roamed the chart, my finger hovering over the blank space where my name should have been. "Where am I sitting?" I asked before I could stop myself. Callista blinked, as though the question surprised her. Then she smiled again, quick and smooth. "Oh, you'll be so busy in the kitchen, Marjorie. It hardly seemed practical to give you a seat. You know how it is, you're in and out all evening. I thought it would be easier for everyone. Easier for everyone." The words fell like stones into the hollow already forming in my chest. I nodded again, the motion automatic. She gave my arm a gentle pat, satisfied, and returned to her clipboard. I stood alone at the table, staring at the neat grid of names. All those squares filled with people expecting to be served, to be hosted, to be entertained. And in the space where my name should have been, only silence. My hands itched to rearrange the cards, to slide one aside and write my own name in its place. But I didn't. Instead, I gathered the empty mugs from the tray and carried them back to the kitchen. The clink of porcelain in the sink echoed louder than it should have. I leaned against the counter, gripping its edge until my knuckles whitened. For years I had told myself it was enough to be needed. That being the one who made everything possible was a kind of belonging. But standing there, invisible even at my own table, I felt the truth settle heavy and undeniable. Being needed was not the same as being valued. I looked back toward the dining room where laughter floated in waves, the chart glowing under the chandelier's light. My name was missing, and suddenly I understood that omission was not an accident. The phone rang the next morning while I was sorting the groceries into some order of preparation. Boxes of flour, sugar, and spices lined the counter like soldiers. 3 turkeys sat heavy in the refrigerator, their bulk reminding me of the burden I'd agreed to or been forced to agree to. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered. It was Helena, Damien's cousin, her voice trembling with that soft brittleness I remembered from the last family gathering. "Marjorie, I wanted to check something with you," she began. "Callista called me yesterday. She said maybe this year I should sit Christmas out. That the mood ought to be cheerful and light, and with the divorce so fresh, I might bring the atmosphere down." I sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the dish towel clenched tight in my fist. "She told you that?" Helena gave a brittle laugh. She dressed it up with sweet words, of course. Said it was out of concern for me, that the holiday might be too much. But we both know what she meant. Images of Helena flooded back, her sitting beside me 2 Christmases ago, helping me peel potatoes, her laughter quick, despite the tension already brewing in her marriage. She had always been kind, never demanding, never ungrateful. And now she was discarded like an ornament deemed unfit for display. I pressed my hand against the cool wood of the table, trying to steady myself. "I'm so sorry, Helena. You should be there." Your family. I thought so too, she whispered. But apparently not the kind that looks good on a seating chart. When we hung up, I sat staring at the silent phone. Her words echoed the discovery I'd made the day before, that even as I bent and stretched myself to keep the machinery of Christmas running, my name had been erased from the list of those who mattered. It was no accident. It was a pattern. I thought of Ruby, my neighbor Vivienne's daughter, who once confided to me how quickly a family could turn cold when you stopped fitting their picture. They'll love you as long as you shine for them, she'd said, but let your light flicker, and they'll set you aside. Now I saw Helena folded out of Christmas, not because she had wronged anyone, but because her sorrow made others uncomfortable. And I saw myself included only as long as my labor covered the cracks. The moment I stopped producing, I too would be deemed too much trouble. The weight of the realization pressed down harder than the turkeys in the fridge. All those years Jonas and I had opened our home, filled it with warmth and food, made sure no one felt left out. He used to say the measure of family was how well you held each other in the worst of times. But Callista had redrawn the measure. Family to her was a performance smiling faces at a perfect table. I walked back to the counter, but the rows of ingredients blurred in my vision. The sugar and flour no longer looked like supplies for celebration. They looked like chains stacked and waiting. Somewhere deep inside, a flicker stirred small, uncertain, but alive. I could feel it growing as I thought of Helena sitting alone on Christmas Day, while I sweated in a kitchen for people who didn't even give me a seat. I touched the guest list still lying on the counter. Callista's handwriting looping and neat, so certain in its authority. I imagined writing Helena's name back in imagined writing my own bold and dark. The thought startled me with its power. I folded the paper slowly, slid it into the drawer beneath the counter, and closed it with deliberate care. The list did not define me nor Helena, nor anyone else discarded for convenience. That night, as the house grew quiet and the lights of the Christmas tree glowed faintly down the hall, I sat awake at the kitchen table, the words circling in my mind. If they could erase Helena so easily, what would stop them from erasing me altogether? The answer came sharp and clear: I would. And as the clock struck midnight, I realized rebellion does not always begin with shouting. Sometimes it begins with refusing to vanish. The morning after Helena's call, I found myself lingering by the window as the first frost melted off the grass. The house was quiet, but my mind was not. I couldn't stop turning over the memories of all the times in my life when respect had been given freely, so freely I had hardly noticed it until it was gone. Before Jonas and I built this life together, I had stood in front of classrooms filled with restless high schoolers, chalk dust on my fingers, a stubborn certainty in my chest that each of them could be more than the world expected. Some days they fought me. Of course, they were teenagers after all. But I can still see the looks in their eyes when something clicked, when an idea finally made sense, when a shy hand raised because they trusted I would listen. Respect wasn't demanded. It bloomed quietly between us, a shared acknowledgement that I mattered, and they mattered too. Even after I retired, that sense of regard lingered. The town remembered me. At the grocery store, former students would wave me down, introducing me to their children as the teacher who made me believe I was smart. I would leave those encounters taller, somehow, steadier, certain that even small roles can leave permanent marks. And then there was Jonas. My husband had a way of showing respect that didn't need words. It was in how he pulled out a chair for me at the table we set together each Christmas, or how he handed me the carving knife like it was a crown. We cooked side by side, not as laborers, but as companions. When he passed, the silence in the kitchen was almost unbearable, but even in memory, his respect held me upright. I pressed my palm against the cold window pane, now watching Damien load firewood into the trunk outside his head, bent over his phone between each trip. Callista stood nearby, issuing instructions, as though directing hired help. Her scarf perfectly arranged, her voice pitched just loud enough for the neighbors to hear her efficiency. It struck me then, the distance between the woman I once was and the woman they saw now. To them, I was an endless resource, hands to peel feet, to fetch eyes to monitor the oven. They never asked. They ordered. And worse, I had let them. When Callista bustled inside, she dropped a sack of linens on the counter, without so much as a glance in my direction. "Make sure these are ironed before Thursday, Marjorie. They wrinkle so easily, and presentation is everything." She didn't wait for an answer, already absorbed in another call, as her heels clicked down the hall. The sack sat heavy beside the bread flour. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Once I had been addressed as Mrs. Fennell by students who looked to me for guidance. Once I had been greeted as Marjorie by townsfolk who valued what I'd given them. Once I had been cherished as love partner equal. Now I was treated as though I were invisible staff, seen only when something needed doing, remembered only when a task went unfinished. The anger rose slowly, like water seeping through cracks in stone. Not a raging fury yet, but a steady swell. It filled my chest, warmed my hands, sharpened my thoughts. Respect had not abandoned me. It had been stolen, piece by piece, replaced with obligation and silence. I folded the towel draped over my shoulder, with precise care set it on top of the sack of linens, and lifted my chin. I was not the servant they imagined. I was not an empty vessel for their needs. I had been respected once, and I would be respected again, if not by them, then by myself. The sound of the clock in the hallway struck noon, steady and insistent, and I knew the days of swallowing every slight were drawing to an end. I had thought the worst of the irritation would be the weight of the shopping bags, the way my knees protested after hauling 3 turkeys into the kitchen. I had not expected criticism about cranberries. Callista found me at the pantry, standing over a pile of jars and cans, as if they were clues to an unsolvable puzzle. "You bought the whole berry sauce?" she asked, fingernails tapping the rim of a jar like a judge's gavel. "I told you, I prefer the smooth. It looks better on the plate." "Presentation?" "Marjorie presentation." My fingers closed around the jar like a reflex. "I thought whole berries tasted better," I said. "People like them homemade." She made a small, impatient noise. "People think they like homemade until they see it. Smooth looks more refined for a formal table. I'll handle the cranberry, actually. Don't worry about it." She took the jar from me as if transferring ownership of some domestic failing. Damien wandered in at that moment, hair mussed from sleep phone in hand. He glanced between us with the detachment of a man accustomed to peace at the cost of someone else's labor. "Whatever you choose, Mom, it'll be fine," he said without looking up. "I'm heading out to help the guys hang lights." He left before I could tell him the cost of my grocery bill or ask if he might manage anything other than his phone. I watched his retreating back and felt something small inside me fray. The cranberry jar sat cool and useless in Callista's hand. I turned back to the counter and began chopping onions for a mirepoix, the rhythmic motion calming and familiar. Loss of control had a way of making the mundane tasks steadier, more honest. Then the knife slipped. It was nothing dramatic, no cartoony geyser of blood or dropped pan, but enough. A thin line opening on my fingertip, warm and surprisingly red against my skin. I pressed the pad of my thumb against it, tasting iron at the corner of my mouth from the shock. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sting and the heat seeping through my towel. Callista looked up more annoyed than concerned. "Be careful," she said, and went back to flipping through her clipboard. Damien didn't even glance up. The words "be careful" hung there perfunctory and hollow, as if she'd wished me luck with a weather forecast. I wrapped my hand in a paper towel, rinsed it under cold water, and pulled my glove from the drawer. It was the same hand I'd used for kneading dough into perfect loaves, the same hand that had steadied a toddler's head while feeding them their first spoonfuls of mashed potatoes. It felt small and faulty now, punctured and somehow emblematic. At noon, Vivienne knocked on the door with a bag of muffins and a look that balanced concern with impatience. She had a habit of arriving exactly when the house's masks were loosest. "How's the siege?" she asked as I opened the door. "Loud," I said, "and efficient." She stepped inside, breathing in the kitchen like someone checking the pulse of a room. Her eyes flicked to my wrapped hand. "You cut yourself," she said, voice flat. "Why are you still using a knife?" I shrugged, embarrassed by the smallness of the wound. "I'll be fine. Just a nick." Vivienne set the muffins down and folded her arms. "You know that isn't the point." She found my apron, smoothed it with a hand that seemed to massage not cloth, but conscience. "You're more than their servant, Marjorie. You always have been. You taught those kids to read, you showed up at town meetings, you held Jonas's hand through the hospital. When did they start treating you like a commodity?" Her red scarf flashed as she leaned in. "Let me clean that properly." She took my hand with a firmness that erased the ache for a minute, cleaned the cut, wrapped it in gauze from her own bag. Her fingers were warm, competent. The touch was small and maternal, and not in the way that silenced, but in the way that steadied. I stood there while she fussed and scolded me for my stubbornness, listening to the easy certainty in her voice. "This is not what you signed up for," she seemed to say. When she finished, she left me with the gauze and a look that implied both pity and exhortation. "Promise me one thing," she said, as she tied her scarf and prepared to leave. "If you can, don't let them pretend you're indispensable. You're not invisible." I watched her go and felt the words settle in like seeds. Alone again, I turned back to the counter, to the pile of dishes, and the mountain of dough waiting to be kneaded and timed and baked. The cut throbbed when I pressed the tip of my finger to the edge of a pastry board. There was blood on my glove's cuff and a faint taste of copper in my mouth, and I counted the hours aloud, needing the arithmetic to make some sense of the coming day. The house had long gone quiet, the kind of silence that feels less like rest and more like neglect. Damien and Callista were asleep upstairs, their dreams untouched by grocery bills, oven schedules, or bleeding fingers. I sat at the kitchen table, a yellow legal pad spread before me, the lamplight throwing sharp shadows across the page. I had lined the pad with columns, turkeys, hams, sides, desserts, each with a start time cook, time oven temperature. My old teacher's handwriting betrayed me. Every letter was neat, every digit certain, though the sum at the bottom was chaos. 3 turkeys each, needing nearly 5 hours, overlapping with pies that wanted a cooler oven, rolls that demanded warmth, casseroles that fought for space. I shifted numbers back and forth like a desperate accountant juggling debts. Even if I started at 4 in the morning, even if I worked without a break, even if I ignored the cut throbbing beneath its bandage, the totals did not add up. 10 hours of labor crammed into 6. 16 dishes in a kitchen built for 4. A body 71 years old trying to perform as though it were 35. I stared at the calculations until they blurred. For decades, I had made numbers behave: budgets, lesson plans, Christmas lists, with Jonas by my side. Now the arithmetic had turned against me. The figures whispered what no one else would say out loud. Survival in this arrangement was impossible. The longer I stared, the more my mind wandered. My pen stilled, and I found myself sketching not turkeys or pies, but the outline of a plane, a crooked little arrow rising toward the corner of the page. I blinked, startled by what my own hand had suggested: escape. The word floated there, half fantasy, half treason. To leave the house, the table, the chart of names, where mine had been omitted. To vanish just as Callista had vanished. Helena with a single phone call. I tried to shake the thought, but it clung stubbornly. I pictured myself slipping out before dawn's suitcase, small ticket in hand. Somewhere with sand underfoot instead of flour salt on the air, instead of cranberry sharpness. Somewhere Jonas would have taken me if he'd had the time. The fantasy was brief but intoxicating. I imagined Callista walking into this kitchen at 2 o'clock sharp, expecting polished silver and gleaming platters, finding instead cold ovens and silence. I imagined Damien realizing his mother's perfection could not be manufactured without invisible labor. For once, their hunger might not be satisfied at my expense. The clock above the stove ticked past midnight. I put my pen down and folded the legal pad closed, though the arithmetic remained etched behind my eyes. No matter how I twisted it, the hours would not stretch. The tasks would not shrink. The numbers would not show mercy. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the darkened window where my own reflection looked back at me. She was tired, older, her eyes ringed with shadow. But she was also sharper than they gave her credit for. She could see the trap because she had lived inside it too long. The thought of escape no longer felt like fantasy. It felt like mathematics, inevitable, the only answer when the equation refused to balance. I pressed my palm against the table, steadying myself. Tomorrow, I would cook, yes. I would chop and knead and stir, because old habits don't vanish overnight. But tonight, as the clock ticked into morning, I admitted the truth: I was already planning a different kind of preparation. Not for a meal, for a departure. The house was asleep when I rose from the table, my joints stiff from sitting too long, my mind sharper than it had been in years. Midnight arithmetic had told me what no one else dared admit: there was no way forward but out. At 2 a.m, I crept upstairs, careful not to let the stairs creak. In my room, the lamplight cast a small circle across the bedspread, enough to guide my hands as I pulled my old suitcase from the closet. Its wheels were stiff, its handle scuffed from years of disuse, but it opened with a sigh like it remembered travel. I folded clothes slowly, not out of indecision, but ritual. 2 dresses, a sweater, the shoes Jonas used to call my walking shoes. A scarf for warmth, though I knew where I was headed would be warmer than this frost-bound house. Each piece, tucked into place, felt like a reclamation, a declaration that I belonged to myself more than to their schedules and demands. At the bottom of the drawer, I found Jonas's old travel journal, its leather cover worn smooth, its pages filled with tiny notes and sketches from trips. We'd taken Chicago in spring, the Smoky Mountains one autumn, a little bed and breakfast in Vermont, where he drew the maple tree outside our window. I pressed it to my chest, eyes stinging, then slipped it into the suitcase. If I was leaving, he would come with me in that way. The air in the hallway was colder as I padded back down to the kitchen. I paused at the counter, the guest list still folded in the drawer beneath. I thought of Helena, uninvited, because her sadness wasn't festive enough, and of my own name missing, as though labor had replaced identity. That list was Callista's gospel. Let her cling to it without me. I tore a sheet of paper from the yellow legal pad and wrote in steady letters. Groceries are in the fridge. Dinner is your problem now. No apologies, no explanations. I left the note by the salt shaker, the same place Jonas had once left me. Quick scribbles before heading to work. Notes of love of ordinary life. Mine would not be love, but truth. I zipped the suitcase quietly, the sound oddly final in the sleeping house. For a moment, I stood in the middle of the kitchen listening. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the faint draft under the door. No footsteps on the stairs. No voices calling me back. The cut on my hand throbbed faintly under its bandage. I pressed my palm against the handle of the suitcase, feeling both pains together, the small stinging one, and the larger invisible one that had been swelling for years. Both had led me here to this moment, to this choice. I wheeled the suitcase gently across the floor and paused by the door. Through the window, I could see frost glittering on the lawn, the driveway stretching toward a road that suddenly felt less like routine and more like release. I reached for my coat on the hook, slid it on, and opened the door slowly, mindful of the hinges. The night air rushed in crisp and bracing, carrying with it the scent of possibility. Behind me, the house remained silent, still believing I was part of it. But ahead, the road gleamed faintly under the streetlight, waiting. I stepped outside, pulled the door shut behind me, and rolled the suitcase across the porch, its wheels clicking against the wood like a heartbeat. The note sat on the kitchen table, and for the first time in years, I left without cleaning up after myself. The wheels of my suitcase hummed over the pavement as I pulled it toward the car. The neighborhood lay still, every porch light extinguished, every window blind drawn tight. The silence of empty suburban roads struck me as eerie, almost conspiratorial, as though the town itself held its breath while I slipped away. The drive passed in fragments, headlights slicing through mist, the dashboard clock glowing 2:47, the occasional deer frozen at the tree line. The farther I drove, the lighter I felt, though the weight of the suitcase beside me reminded me I carried not just clothes, but an entire reckoning. By the time I reached the airport, the sky had softened into gray, the first blush of morning pushing at the horizon. Inside the terminal echoed with that strange pre-dawn hush-cleaning crews wheeling mops, travelers murmuring into phones, announcements crackling in half-empty halls. I checked in the agent, sliding my boarding pass across the counter without question, as if women in their 70s often left home in the dead of night with one suitcase and no return plan. Perhaps they did. Perhaps I wasn't the first to discover that freedom sometimes begins at unreasonable hours. With time before boarding, I found myself in the small airport cafe. Its fluorescent lights were too bright, its coffee bitter, but the warmth of the cup steadied my hands. I chose a table by the window, where the tarmac stretched wide and endless planes lined like promises waiting to be kept. That was when she sat down across from me, a younger woman, perhaps 30. Her hair pulled back hastily, her sweater wrinkled from hurried packing. She offered a tentative smile, the kind that recognized itself in another. "Running away too?" she asked lightly, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. I startled, then laughed softly. "Something like that." She stirred sugar into her coffee with more force than necessary. "My mother thinks Christmas is her stage show. I was supposed to play the part of the perfect daughter pretending my marriage isn't falling apart. I decided I'd rather face an empty beach than another lecture about appearances." Her words struck me with uncanny familiarity, though her details were different. She was me years earlier, still young enough to be expected to bend, but already worn by the weight of other people's scripts. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness less noticeable now. I was supposed to cook Christmas dinner for 30. Alone. Her eyes widened. 30. By yourself. I nodded, a rueful smile tugging at my mouth. Apparently, I always manage. But last night the numbers told me otherwise. The math doesn't lie. She laughed, the sound brittle but genuine. You sound like my grandmother. She used to say when the figures don't add up, you don't argue with them, you change the problem. We sat there in companionable silence, two women separated by decades, but bound by the same thread of exhaustion, of invisibility. For a fleeting moment I felt less alone. The airport hummed around us, but at that table I had something Damien and Callista had long refused me recognition. When the boarding call came, we stood together gathering our coats and bags. She squeezed my arm before walking toward her gate. Good luck, she said simply. Good luck to you too. I watched her go, her shoulders straightening, as though the act of leaving had already lightened her. Then I turned toward my own gate, my suitcase trailing obediently behind me. Outside the window, the horizon burned gold, the sun finally breaking free. As I stepped into the line of passengers, I realized with a strange calm that strangers had seen me more clearly in minutes than my own family had in years. And with that thought steadying me, I walked down the jetway toward the plane. The cabin smelled faintly of stale air and brewed coffee, but to me, it smelled like possibility. I settled into my seat by the window, the hum of engines vibrating through the floor and up into my chest. My suitcase rested. Overhead, my note sat on the kitchen table miles behind, and for the first time in years, I felt the smallest outline of a boundary forming around me, mine, not theirs. As the plane began to taxi, I pressed my forehead to the cold glass. The runway stretched out in front of us, endless and clean, a strip of slate daring me forward. My heart knocked against my ribs harder than it had in years, and with it came memories of Jonas. He had always believed in motion. You can't let them shrink you, Marjorie, he'd say when a colleague dismissed my ideas at school board meetings. Respect isn't a gift you wait to receive. It's a truth you insist on. He'd put his hand over mine, grounding me, reminding me that my worth wasn't negotiable. I heard his voice again, now layered over the captain's announcement of departure. Don't disappear, love. Not for anyone. The wheels lifted from the ground and the sensation tugged something loose inside me. My chest ached. My throat tightened, and before I could stop it, tears rolled hot down my cheeks. I turned slightly toward the window, letting the bright rise of dawn disguise the blur in my eyes. I cried for the years I'd bent myself into silence. I cried for Helena dismissed for her sadness. For every holiday Jonas and I had made beautiful together, only for those who sat at the table to forget who had created it. And I cried for myself for the woman who had taught and laughed and built and still somehow allowed herself to be erased. The sobs came quiet but relentless, the kind that emptied rather than drowned. My hand pressed against Jonas's old journal in my bag, and I imagined him sitting beside me smiling, the way he used to when he wanted me to see that life could be larger than my fear. Somewhere over the clouds, the tears softened. Relief replaced them, gentle and surprising. I had not broken by leaving. I had expanded. The ache in my chest eased into something else, something close to exhilaration. I inhaled long and steady and noticed how sharp the air felt in my lungs, how alive my skin felt under the thin airline blanket. My reflection in the window was lined older, marked by time, but her eyes were alight, almost mischievous. The engines roared steady, carrying me farther from obligation with every mile. I thought of the note back on the counter. Dinner is your problem now. It wasn't bitterness that lingered, but clarity. For once, the burden was not mine, and the world had not ended. I closed my eyes and pictured Jonas again, his hand at the small of my back, his voice low. Proud of you. For the first time since his passing, I felt him near, not as a ghost of grief, but as a companion urging me on. The plane banked east toward the rising sun, and light poured across the cabin in golden bands. I opened my eyes and let it touch me, warming the streaks of salt on my face until they dried. I was not afraid anymore. I was astonishingly alive. I did not need to be there to see it. The scenes unfolded in my mind as vividly as if I'd left a camera behind. Perhaps it was years of teaching of managing chaos before it erupted that let me predict every step. Damien would stumble into the kitchen first, yawning, expecting the rich smell of roasting turkeys. Instead, he'd find silence, the counters bare, save for groceries crammed into the fridge. He'd blink confused, checking the clock, then call out my name once, twice louder, before realizing I wasn't anywhere in the house. Callista would come next, her hair already set clipboard in hand, ready to oversee perfection. She'd swing into the kitchen with that quick confidence of hers, only to stop short at the sight of unopened bags, flour still sealed pans still stacked. No golden bird in the oven, no side dishes neatly prepped. Just emptiness. I could hear her voice sharp with disbelief. She left. What do you mean? She left. Damien, still clutching his phone, would mutter something about a note. He'd find it where I left it by the salt shaker, the words short and final. Groceries are in the fridge. Dinner is your problem now. Callista's fury would spread faster than the scent of any meal I might have cooked. This is sabotage, she would declare. She's ruined everything. But the clock would keep ticking, and the doorbell would soon ring. The first guests would arrive expecting warmth wine and the orchestrated feast Callista had promised. Instead, they would step into a kitchen that looked more like a storeroom than a sanctuary. Smiles would falter. Coats would be hung with hesitation questions whispered behind polite laughter. Damien, still scrolling, would begin calling caterers. I could see him pacing the hallway phone, pressed tight, his tone climbing with each rejection. 30 people this afternoon, he'd plead, and I could hear the laughter on the other end. Chefs, already knee-deep in their own holiday service, incredulous that anyone would think such a thing possible. No one can bail you out, the silence of their refusals would say. Meanwhile, the living room would fill cousins balancing bottles of wine, children, tugging at their parents, colleagues of Damien's, glancing uneasily at one another. The table set so carefully with place cards would gleam under the chandelier, waiting for a feast that did not exist. Panic would creep in like smoke. I could picture Callista darting between rooms, offering brittle reassurances, her smile cracking. Just a small delay, everyone. Marjorie had things well in hand. But then someone would peek into the kitchen and see the truth, not a single dish, prepared turkeys, still cold in their wrapping, vegetables unwashed. And the murmurs would grow. I wasn't there, but the whispers reached me anyway, carried like smoke through the family's grapevine. Airports and oceans can't stop gossip. It seeps through texts, voicemails, and cousinly confessions. By the time my plane leveled above the clouds, the story was already fermenting in living rooms back home. Some called me selfish. I could almost hear Aunt Margaret's sharp tongue, who abandons family on Christmas morning. It's shameful. Others no doubt nodded along, eager to condemn because criticism is easier than empathy. To them, I was the villain, the missing gear, in a machine that no longer ran smoothly. But not all voices sang the same note. I heard through a neighbor's message that Cousin Leonard of all people had muttered, "You know, maybe she had a point. Nobody can cook for 30 alone." That quiet dissent was quickly hushed, but it was there, a crack in the wall. And then, in the middle of my layover, my phone buzzed. A message blinked across the screen from a number I hadn't seen in months. Ruby Ann, my granddaughter. "Grandma, I miss you, not the food." I sat down hard in the Gates plastic chair, tears springing before I could blink them back. Those words were a lifeline proof that not everyone measured me by casseroles and cranberry sauce. She wrote again. "They're all arguing here. Some people say you ruined Christmas, but I told them you deserve a Christmas too." The edges of my anger softened into something gentler, though no less firm. For so long, I had convinced myself that leaving would mean losing them all, that if I stepped away from service, I'd step out of love entirely. But here was my granddaughter, seeing me not as staff or savior, but simply as herself's grandmother. I typed back slowly, fingers trembling. "Thank you, Ruby Ann. That means more than you know. Be kind to yourself. Eat what you like, not just what's served." Her reply came quickly, a small rebellion whispered through glowing letters. "Wish you were here, but also proud you're not." I smiled even as my chest ached. That girl had more clarity at 17 than many grown adults in that dining room. She saw what others refused to, that love does not vanish when you set boundaries. Still, I knew the louder voices would keep echoing for a long time. Damien embarrassed in front of his colleagues. Callista frantic to repair her image. The aunts and uncles shuffling blame around the table like cards they didn't want to hold. Those voices had power in numbers and volume in years of habit. But the quiet truths carried more weight. The small admittance from Leonard. The brave words of Ruby Ann. The stranger at the airport cafe who had seen me even for a moment. As the boarding call echoed through the terminal, I gathered my things and walked toward the gate. Ruby Ann's words lighting the path brighter than any announcement. The critics would roar yes, but I was learning to tune my ear elsewhere. The salt air met me before the taxi even stopped at the inn. Florida's coast was quieter than I imagined for Christmas Day. Waves rolling steady gulls, swooping low, the faint sound of carols leaking from a radio behind the front desk. The inn itself was simple white clapboard with green shutters, a string of lights strung along the porch, like a friendly afterthought. Inside, I found warmth not just from the heater, but from the smiles. The woman at the desk, hair pinned up loosely, wished me Merry Christmas, as though I were kin. A man by the fireplace offered me a mug of cider without asking my name. There were no demands, no checklists, no clipped instructions, just welcome. I carried my small suitcase up to the room unpacked, only what I needed, then let the rest stay folded. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to measure my worth by the number of dishes I could bring to a table. Dinner was served in the small dining hall, the kind of room that could have been a family's living space, if not for the scatter of tables. I ordered hot soup steam curling in the air and a slice of pie for dessert. No one asked how long it had taken me, what recipe I'd used, whether the crust was homemade. I lifted the spoon to my lips, and the flavor, simple, salty, comforting, was sweeter than any feast I'd ever labored over. At the next table, locals shared stories of past Christmases gone awry, burned turkeys, power outages, children spilling cranberry sauce across tablecloths. We laughed together, the sound filling the room without tension. I joined in, easily unburdened, just another person enjoying a meal on a holiday. When the pie arrived, its filling soft and tart, I ate slowly, savoring each bite, not for its perfection, but for its ease. Delicious because I hadn't made it. Sweet because it belonged only to me. Later, I walked to the shoreline, the air cool against my cheeks. The ocean stretched wide, endless, unconcerned with missing names on seating charts or menus written in gold ink. The waves didn't demand. They simply arrived again and again like grace. I stood there with my shoes in hand, the sand damp beneath my feet, and thought I have given decades to tradition. Today, I chose freedom, and it tasted better than anything on that table back home. The morning after Christmas, I woke to the sound of gulls calling outside my window and the steady hush of waves. My phone left on the nightstand blinked with notifications, dozens of them. I sat on the edge of the bed and scrolled. Damien's messages came first, sharp and frantic. How could you walk out like that? Do you know what you did to us? Callista's followed, colder, but no less furious. You embarrassed us in front of everyone. People were humiliated. I hope you're happy. Others chimed in, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, aunts who rarely called all suddenly passionate about tradition. Their words burned with blame, though not one asked if I was all right. And then buried between the noise I found Ruby Ann's message. Short, gentle grandma. I'm sorry they're being cruel. Dinner was a mess without you, but I told everyone I missed you. Not your cooking. Just you. I closed my eyes and let the words settle, cooling the fire of the others. In that single line, she had reached me, offered what no one else had: truth, without condition. I opened the notebook I'd bought at the airport gift shop, its cover, plain, its pages unlined. On the first page, I wrote slowly the words, steadying me as they formed. To my family, groceries, pies, and polished tables are not the measure of my worth. I have given decades to serving, and in return, I was erased. Respect is the only invitation I accept now. Without it, there will be no seat saved, no dish prepared, no presents given. With it, perhaps one day I'll join you again. I read it twice, then typed it into my phone and sent it to them all. My hand didn't tremble. The replies came quickly, more anger, more protests, attempts to twist the words into guilt. But I let the phone buzz unanswered because the boundary had already been drawn. When I finally set it down, I stepped out to the balcony. The sea stretched wide and indifferent, reminding me that tides move on, whether anyone approves. I wrapped Jonas's old scarf around my shoulders, breathed deep of the salt air, and felt something inside me click into place. Not absence, but strength. The letter was not an ending. It was the price of my return, should anyone ever choose to pay it. When I returned weeks later, the house looked the same, but it no longer felt like mine. The wreath Callista had chosen was still crooked on the door. Inside, the faint smell of pine had gone sour. Needles scattered across the rug where no one had bothered to sweep. Damien hovered in the kitchen, trying to sound casual, but failing. Mom, people are still talking. They don't understand why you left. His words trailed off his thumb, flicking across his phone, even as he spoke. I studied him carefully. My son grown capable, yet bewildered that his mother had stepped out of line. You'll learn, Damien, I said gently. One day you'll understand that silence isn't the same as love, and service isn't the same as respect. He nodded, uncertain, then slipped away. Callista barely looked at me when I passed her in the hall. Her eyes were polished glass, her smile faint and strained. We coexisted politely, but there was distance now, a frost she didn't try to thaw. For the first time, I welcomed it. Later in the kitchen, I opened the drawer where the spare key to the back door had always rested. My fingers closed around it, cool and familiar. For years, it had been a symbol of access, of obligation, the expectation that I was always available, always reachable, always ready to provide. I held it a long time before carrying it upstairs. In my room, I opened Jonas's old wooden box, the one where he kept small treasures. Train tickets, pressed flowers, a coin he once called lucky. I placed the key inside and whispered, "Not for intrusion, only for respect." Then I closed the lid and turned the lock. The next afternoon, I brewed tea and set out 3 cups, no more. Vivienne arrived in her red scarf, bringing fresh bread from the bakery. Ruby Ann slipped in quietly, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes lighting when she saw me. We sat around the table, steam rising between us, and for once I didn't feel the weight of 30 mouths waiting to be fed. The laughter was easy, the silence comfortable. I served pie I had bought not baked, and it was just as sweet for it. Vivienne raised her cup. To choosing ourselves, she set her eyes steady on mine. Ruby Ann added softly, to never disappearing again. We clinked our cups, and the sound was delicate but resolute like glass, chiming in winter air. Outside, snow began to fall, soft flakes, drifting past the window, settling over the lawn in quiet layers. Inside, the tea warmed my hands, my chest, the hollow places that had once ached from being unseen. For the first time in years, the door behind me felt secure, not shut forever, but mine to open, mine to guard. And as the snow deepened, I sat in the glow of lamplight, the laughter of 2 women beside me, and a door I finally controlled. Outline.